Good afternoon. Welcome to EduSat Network. We are organizing today a lecture on contemporary political thinker. We will try to understand the link between ancient to present day, how the political thinking have evolved over the years, and the contributors who shaped the different ideas and different ideals. So, for discussion on this great topic, we have in studio Dr. Satish Jha. He will talk about the contemporary political philosophy and political science thinker. And as you know, he teaches political science in Delhi University and keen interest on the political happening and political all about the country and in the world, and writes for the different journals and international journals. So I hope his knowledge and experience will help us to understand the contemporary situation in a new perspective. So on behalf, I welcome Dr. Jha for EduSat lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mahendraji. In fact, today's discussion on Indian political thinkers and political thinking in India, I will utilize this opportunity to focus on the modern period. If we go by the periodization in terms of ancient, medieval and modern, that how Indian political thought in modern time has acquired certain the features or dimensions which both unite with its ancient counterpart as well as set them apart in terms of the larger issues on which it dialogued and debated, and particularly the way it engaged with the challenges which were being thrown by Indian society, Indian politics, and most importantly the colonial power structure, which was the immediate reference point for modern Indian thinking. Now, before I move further, there are few preliminary comments which are required. Number one, that when we talk of Indian political thought, normally we deal with the history of Indian political thought. Why is it so? Because you see, what we study in name of political thought in India is mostly the history related to the evolution of those ideas, or the history related to those struggles, those engagements which resulted into certain ideas which have acquired the shape and stature of thinking and thought. So that is one thing which is, we should keep in our mind, that history of the Indian society, history of Indian politics, and then at the same time the history of ideas is as important as the discussion of ideas in themselves. So this is something very significant about the Indian political thought. Another important dimension is that in modern times particularly, the Indian thought can be seen in the practice, in the realm of practice, the practical politics, one can say, because those whom we consider political thinkers in modern times, those whom we study as as political thinkers, and those ideas which we consider as a political thought, were those people who basically engaged with the challenges thrown by the society, the challenges which they confronted in Indian context. Therefore, they were in fact practitioners of politics, so to say. And while practicing, the politics, practical politics, or one can say that engaged with the day-to-day problem of society, they came out with certain ideas based on their experiences as well as their understanding of the problem, which have acquired such an important stature that we cannot ignore them if we try to understand the societal context of that period, as well as the contemporary reality or contemporary, politics, society, or for that matter, any issues related to Indian, uh, you know, Indian society or Indian history. So that is another important dimension. Now, if we compare this dimension of Indian political thought with the Western one, then we find a marked difference. Because in West, what happened that, in course of time, there was a professionalization of this, this enterprise. Professionalization, or one can say that those who engaged with and those who reflected on the issues pertaining to society, pertaining to people, pertaining to their culture, they were the professional academicians located in the university system in modern times, particularly the modern universities in the West, and therefore many of them were professional trained academicians who, in fact, engaged with a number of issues, and in that context they came out with some ideas which have universal application and validity, and therefore even we in India consider those ideas very relevant at times, and that becomes the reference point. It is a different matter that there was a period when the Indian academics mostly relied on those ideas and simply ignored the other contexts in which similar important ideas emerged. But now, of course, things have changed a little bit. But still, those ideas which have emerged in the West, mostly in context of their own situation, have acquired a universal application and validity, and therefore, in fact, they are important reference point even today. But those who were doing it were the professional trained academicians who knew the tools of inquiry, who were basically trained to do such exercises. And therefore, if we compare the Indian and the Western, then we find that when we basically discuss the Western political thought, we start with the professional with academicians who might have had some connections, linkage with the practice of politics or the movements in the society. I mean, the political movement, the social movement, but nonetheless, they were, in a general sense of the term, were professional, thinkers. They were thinkers by profession, not by vocation, as we find the Indian context. So, therefore, this professionalization of thought is one significant difference we can see between the Indian and the Western one. Because in India, when we come to India, those whose ideas are today's, in today's context, our reference point for understanding Indian political thinking, they were the ones who engaged with the national, national movement, those who engaged with the colonial power structure, those who were part and parcel of the Indian political process. They were the products of Indian struggles. Therefore, they didn't have that type of sophisticated, organized corpus of ideas which normally one can see in the Western context. And therefore, what we have to do here, that we have to indulge in exercise which can be called history of political thought. That how this entire exercise was done, what was its larger context, and from that perspective, one has to derive certain things, and they have to be interpreted and understood. Therefore, this job of interpretation is very important here. Now, again, this interpretation itself is a loaded term, because when we try to interpret, there are a lot of debates within political thought today. Political theory, in fact, is basically dealing with this matter, that how to have the correct interpretation, the true interpretation. or interpretation which can be closer to truth. But the fact of the matter is that any interpretation which is being done for something which happened in the past can approximate to, can go closer to the correct version of it, or one can say that one can claim that it is perhaps the closer, the closest one can think of. But still, there will be gaps, because after all, this entire exercise is subjective. The hermeneutic exercise is itself a subjective and therefore value loaded exercise. Therefore, one can never have the interpretation. Now, coming to the Indian thought, therefore, what we find that this interpretation is to be, is little bit a problematic exercise, because if we try to interpret things, then number one, the tools and the techniques which are available today for interpreting and understanding political thought as they have been handed down by these disciplines, social science as a whole, I think may not be able to capture some of the nuances of this political thinking, which on the face of it may not appear as coherent and sophisticated as perhaps the Western political thought may appear to be. So therefore, we have to be on our guard while basically engaging with the Indian political tradition, or the tradition of thinking in India, that whether we should use the same tools and techniques for interpreting them as we normally apply in context of the Western thinkers, or should we think in terms of having some alternative set of approaches to look at their ideas, to understand their ideas, the nuances of their thinking. So therefore, this method, entire question of methodology is very important, and to how to approach them. Now, for example, you see now a lot of people have started thinking that instead of this debate, the right word for approaching them could be dialogue. That how a dialogue can be established between what they said and what we feel today. We basically feel not only about them but also about our own challenges, and therefore how to have a kind of engagement between the two, the past and the present, the thinkers of that era, thinkers of that age and their ideas, and the challenges which we encounter today. So this dialogue, the tradition of dialogue, which in fact is not simply based on rejection or negation in the simplistic sense of the term, but even if the rejection is there, it is quite complex and and also quite intricate. So therefore, the rejection is itself a complex category in Indian context, particularly in context of their thinking, the modern thinking of these people whom we consider modern Indian thinkers. I will come to this issue, that how this can be seen in their ideas. But at the same time, this rejection or the negation in Indian tradition of particularly Indian philosophy itself is a matter of investigation, because it is not highly simplistic rejection or negation, but in fact it rejects as well as also takes those important things which can facilitate the evolution and generation of emancipatory ideas. So therefore, the rejection is always selective, rejection is always qualified, and rejection is always progressive, in the sense that it is not sectarian, or it is not loaded with negativity, but it has always a positive content, that it rejects as well as it also appropriates, or one can say that it also absorbs certain features of what it rejects in order to arrive at higher level of understanding of both society, politics, and so on and so forth. So these two methodological issues are very important for approaching Indian political thought. Now, coming, going back to what I was referring to, this professionalization of this practice, or professionalization of this enterprise in the West. Now, it is not that only in West it happened, but subsequently we find that in post-independent period after 1947, when the context of colonialism disappeared, I think this professionalization of this enterprise was also attempted in India. For example, what we find that before 1947, the ideas which we study in name of political thought were mostly the ideas of those people who indulged in anti-colonial struggles or the struggles within the society, Indian society, related to many issues which had, two faces. One was, it was response to the colonial state, colonial power structure. Another was the internal power dynamics of Indian society. But what is more important here is that they were part and parcel or integral part of the struggles within the Indian society as a whole. Now, after 1947, what happened that when this colonial context was no longer there, so attempt was made to to shift this domain from society to the state, particularly the state institutions, and in fact, university system became one important institution of the state under which such exercises were to be done. Therefore, of course, this started during the colonial period itself, when the first university system came into existence in India after 1857, when the first three universities were established in the three presidencies, then presidencies. I mean, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, the first three universities after 1857. And as per the scheme of things existing in the West, I mean, these universities were established on the same framework as it was in operation in the West. I mean, the distinction between the social science, the natural science and humanities, the distinction between the theory and the practice part of these disciplines, and therefore if one looks at the overall organization of the Indian university system after 1857, one finds that they were basically the replica of the Western Western experience, or the Western system of knowledge as they were operationalized through modern institutions, particularly the university system. So in post 1947, what we find that these disciplines, mostly the social sciences, were entrusted with this job to come out or to basically reflect on or to engage with the problems, to engage with the challenges which would be coming from the society. And basically they were also interested with the task of coming out with certain ideas, certain reflections, and therefore engaging and engaging with a prescriptive exercise, so that the modern nation state, as it happened in 1947, that it was no longer a state, but the nation joined hands with the state. Therefore, this modern nation state was supposed to rely on this system to provide them with the resources, or to provide them with certain certain facts, certain certain ideas, on basis of which the policies formulation could be made. And the entire idea of freedom, which was very important in this framework, could be made actual, or this entire discourse of freedom could be realized. So this, keeping that in mind, what we find at post 1947 period, we have had number of experiments in a realm of knowledge, how to institutionalize and organize knowledge in India. And therefore this attempt took the Indian state towards reforming or reorganizing the Indian university system. And therefore post 1947 period, we can see that number of commissions or committees being entrusted with this job, starting with the Radhakrishnan committee. Subsequently you had the Kothari committee, and then 1986 you have had the whole exercise of new education policy. And then in the era of neoliberal reforms, we don't have a committee of that type, but still we find many piecemeal attempts in that direction, that how to organize Indian knowledge system, through which the entire discourse of freedom, empowerment and other issues can be realized. Now, but at the same time, we have also discovered that all these attempts have proved have proved themselves to be inadequate, because again and again, these reports have been revisited and attempts have been made to improve on them, but nothing tangible has emerged so far. And therefore, still we find that a lot of disconnect exists between the society and the thinking which is located in the university system. Now, this disconnect is largely due to the disconnect between the theory and the practice. Those who are engaged with the practice of, those who are engaged with, or those who have hands-on experience of the Indian situation, those who are exposed to Indian reality and Indian challenges, perhaps they are not the ones who are engaged with this thinking process, which is located within these institutional setup, institutional framework. And therefore, this disconnect has led to a kind of disillusionment with the entire exercise, that after all, what utility do we have of this knowledge system, which is not coming out with any meaningful exercise, or which is not providing us with any meaningful guidelines, or any meaningful resources through which we can engage with our own reality. So therefore, this disillusionment is largely due to this disconnect between the theory and the practice of knowledge system. And therefore, we find that the modern Indian political thought becomes very important here, because if we look at the entire corpus of ideas which have been provided by these thinkers in modern times, we don't find this disconnect between the theory and the practice, because number one, they were indulging in day-to-day politics. And secondly, the thing is that they didn't have this institutional constraints on them, because they were part of the civil society, they were part of the larger societal process, and therefore they didn't have the constraint of institutional paraphernalia, or one can say the formalism of institutions, which normally act as a constraint. So, in that context, this modern Indian thinking is very significant and also useful if we really want to carve out or find out a new niche or a different direction for our projects. Now, these attempts, mostly which were done in modern post-independent period in form of these reforms and these commissions and committees, were I must put it at the very outset that they were exercised in a realm of modernity, because how these there are certain characteristics, features of modernity, and therefore how these modern institutions can function in modern context, and how the knowledge system can be more operative, can be more functional within the modern setting. And therefore, that was the main reference point for all these exercises, whether it was Radhakrishnan Committee or Kothari Committee, or for that matter 1986 or the new liberal era. So I think this reference point has been this modern institutional thinking, or one can say that the modernity as a whole. Now, but if we look at our own political tradition of political thinking in India, particularly in modern times, in fact, we find that it was much more than simply an engagement with modernity. There is no denying the fact that they had a dialogue with modernity, but they also had a dialogue which went beyond modernity. So one can say that it was both a dialogue with modernity and beyond. Their vision didn't get confined to simply the issues pertaining to modernity, but they also reflected, they also thought about certain situations which could go beyond the modern situation. And therefore, one can put it differently, that it was basically a dialogue for emancipation, not simply freedom. One can say that modernity at times is reduced to the exercise of freedom, but emancipation is much more complex, and emancipation is bigger than freedom. So therefore, this modern Indian thinking had two reference points. One, of course, the modernity, and secondly, it also tried to transcend it or go in direction of emancipation. Now, it is this dimension of beyond, I mean, which I feel is this emancipation or emancipatory project, which also takes this entire tradition of modern Indian thinking closer to both Indian philosophy, and not only Indian philosophy, but also resources from different traditions. One can say that in that sense, one cannot say that Indian political thinking or Indian political thought was sectarian. At least certain strands within Indian political thought was not sectarian, because it didn't confine its vision simply to the Indian territorial boundaries in terms of the resources, but they also engaged with other traditions. They simply didn't confine their vision to those traditions which in modern times have been called secular traditions, but they also engaged with certain traditions which one can call theology or religion. So philosophy, religion, and both the Indian as well as the Western became their archival sources, one can say, from which they tried to derive their resources to generate their ideas for emancipation. So one can say that it was really much more universal, it was holistic, as well as one can say it was totally non-sectarian. Therefore, this entire concept of being and otherness, I mean, one can say the self and the other, this distinction at times was sought to be blurred, or this distinction was sought to be negated in this tradition, because simply this process of othering prohibits one to look towards the other traditions or the resources which are available in other traditions or other societies, but simply because they are not bogged down by this othering process, therefore they could approach or they could move very comfortably toward different traditions of political thought and tradition. Now, the best example is Gandhi's Hindu Swaraj. In fact, Gandhi's Hindu Swaraj, as is normally believed, that is basically a critique of Western civilization. But it is not simply that. It is not only critique of Western civilization, but it is also critique of modernity. But what is interesting is the fact that Gandhi's this critique of Western civilization, which we find in the Hindu Swaraj, and when one looks at the references given in the book, the most important references for further exploration are not from the Indian tradition, but from the Western tradition of thought. I mean, Carpenter is referred, Tolstoy and Thoreau, so is Ruskin, and all of them belong to the Western tradition, not the Indian tradition. Of course, if we look deep down, then we find that there are innumerable instances, methodological instances. There are innumerable reflections which one can see coming from the Indian philosophical discourse. Particularly, one can see them coming from the different religious traditions. Zionism, whether it is this Anekantavad or Shyadbad or many other traditions. So in fact, one can find lot of ideas and reflections coming from the Hindu tradition, particularly Bhagavad Gita and many other things. So therefore, one finds that in Gandhi, that though the book is essentially geared towards a critique of Western civilization, but the value of those ideas which have emerged in the West have not been undermined or undervalued. And therefore, when one looks at the references for further exploration, one finds the examples mostly coming from the West. Now, another example one can give is of Ambedkar. The Ambedkar's most trenchant critique has been of the Indian, particularly the uh, Hindu tradition, or Hindu political thought, or one can say that Hindu practices which are basically endemic to Hinduism. But when it comes to the larger emancipatory discourse within Ambedkar's ideas, one finds that Ambedkar does not go to other traditions, but he basically falls back on the Buddhism, not only in terms of his conversion to Buddhism, but his reinterpretation of Buddhism, and the way he tries to relate the two discourses, Buddha and Karl Marx, the two emancipatory projects which he counterposes against each other, and finally tries to provide a very creative interpretation of the two. Therefore, what we find that on the one hand he rejects, but at the same time he also he has a rejection which one can say is a qualified rejection. It is a much more intricate rejection. It's a negation and rejection, but not a simplistic one. It's a very intricate and complex, and therefore that what ultimately the ultimate aim is to create a project or a discourse of emancipation which need not to be sectarian, which need not to be parochial, which need not to be prejudiced and biased. Therefore, whatever is good in any tradition has to be acknowledged and respected, and has to be borrowed. And so we find that even in Ambedkar, that in spite of the critique which he offers of Hinduism and the practices which are associated with the Indian caste system, we find that Ambedkar also looks for the resources within this tradition, particular philosophical tradition, and he in fact considers Buddhism as an important reference point. So I think in both, in case of Gandhi and Ambedkar, one can see this this feature coming out sharply, that how this rejection is not a simplistic, or one can say that one-sided rejection, but it is very complex, and one can say a very loaded rejection which is qualified adequately by a number of ideas and number of conditionalities. Now, coming back to the issue of the modern political thought, in context of some of the methodological issues I have outlined here, there are another set of issues which need our attention. The first is that Indian political thought emerged, modern Indian political thought particularly, it emerged in context of the colonial intervention in Indian society. Therefore, we find that most of the Indian political thinkers, from Ram Mohan Roy to many others who followed him, there were three important reference points. The first was modernity, the second was the issue of science, and the third was the issue of progress. Now, this modernity implied three set of things, set of factors. The first, the nation state. Two, the entire issue of democracy. And three, the entire question of secularization, issue of secularization or secularism. So therefore, most of the thinkers in India in modern times basically engaged with these three issues: that nation state, what is this nation and what is this state, what role do they have in the life of the people, what role they can play in the freedom of the people or emancipation of the people, and democracy, how this self rule or self government can be understood. What is this government, what is this authority, relationship between authority and freedom, and particularly this authority in terms of the self rule, how it can be actualized. So this entire question of democracy was also very complex one in Indian thinking, because it was not simply looked at from the point of view of a representative democracy as it has happened within the liberalism, or liberal political thought of the West. But it was much more than simply a representative form of government. It was even if it was representation, it was representation of self, and therefore self-determination and self-government was important theme. It was a running theme within Indian political thinking in modern time. And another set of question which is related to this entire discourse of modernity, that is secularism or secularization, was equally prominent in modern Indian thinkers. That what is the nature of secularization, what is the meaning of secularization, to what extent this secularization can go hand in hand with other processes of society where perhaps not secularization but some other processes may be important. So all these issues have been the integral part of Indian political thinking in modern times. Now, apart from this discourse of modernity, another reference point has been the issue of science. When we talk of science, it is not simply science understood in the positivist sense, as we know the science as understood in the Western discourse, objective science or objective truth. But basically, this has been largely related to the issue of truth and knowledge. That what is truth and what is knowledge? How one can acquire knowledge, and how ultimately that knowledge can go in direction of taking the people closer to the truth or approximation of truth. Similarly, another issue related to this discourse of science has been experience and the selfhood. That what how one can base one's knowledge on the experience, or the experience of self, and how that experience can be basis for knowledge generation, or how this experiential knowledge can be insulated from the identity question and can be made an exercise in domain of truth or universal knowledge. So I think this experience, selfhood, identity, these issues are equally prominent along with this discourse of modernity. Now the third dimension which we find is also very important in Indian political thinkers is the question of progress. That what is progress? Now the West, particularly the Western political thought, put forth a blueprint of progress, and it was basically laced with this modernist symbols or modernity and the modernist framework, under which it was stated that progress is well defined, progress is well stated, progress is well experienced. Therefore, what has happened in the West in last 400 years, I think implies progress. So progress was, number one, quantified, and number two, it was objectified. Whereas I think that when Indian thinkers approach this issue, They not simply interrogated it, but try to basically look at the entire issue of progress from different perspective, and therefore it opened up a new possibilities for engaging with this question of progress, particularly of human progress and humanity. And therefore this issue is intimately related with the question of emancipation, because the way the progress was understood in the Western political thought was mostly understood in terms of the freedom, and that freedom was also understood mostly in terms of institutional freedom. Freedom was defined as a negative freedom, and even if it was at times qualified with the positive content, but still it was put within the broad ambit of modern institutions, whether it was a state or civil society, or for that matter anything else. Now, when Indian thinkers engage with this issue of progress, they raise number of questions. They put number of questions and number of challenges. For example, it is interesting that when engaging with the colonialism or the discourse of empire or discourse of imperialism, as it was coming from the West, particularly in context of the British colonial power structure in India. In fact, the essential reference point at that time was James Mill's History of British India, and his son John Stuart Mill's reflections, philosophical reflections on both representative government and on liberty. Therefore, in these discourses it was stated very clearly that progress has been attained in the West, and therefore those countries who want to attain the same level of maturity, same level of freedom, same level of progress, they have to tread the same path. Now, there were two attempts to engage with this discourse. One attempt, one can say, was a derivative, as Partha Chatterjee and others political scientists have been using the term derivative discourse, that one can call it imitative, that they try to provide a matching parallel, that what West has attained now, India has had always in the past. Therefore, if West has a secular polity today, India has had secularism in the past, and therefore if you have James Mill History of British India or John Stuart Mill Reflections on Representative Government and Liberty, you have a matching parallel discourse in Nehru's Discovery of India, where you have the references of Ashoka, the Mauryan king, and the Akbar, the Mughal emperor who practiced secularism. You have the number of instances through which it is proved and established that India has a syncretic culture, and tolerance, which is basically, one can say, the other name of secularism, that tolerance was always part of the Indian culture. So you have a kind of perspective which tries to counter it in by ransacking the Indians, our own tradition, by referring to our own tradition, and by trying to demonstrate that India has had all these features, but they have been only disturbed due to the colonial invasion, and if once the colonialism is gone, again India can bring itself back on the track. And therefore, this progress, the notion of progress, the notion of the freedom, they are not questioned in this tradition, but in fact it is acknowledged, and it is stated that this is perhaps the definition of freedom and progress, but Indians have had this in the past, and again in the future they can also acquire the same thing. There is nothing so special about the colonial tutelage or the colonial supervision. But on the other hand, we find that there is a counter tradition which not simply tries to use the resources of history to establish this fact that India has had all these things in the past, and therefore this question of progress, Indians need not to learn from the Westerners, but in fact India can demonstrate that Indians are as progressive in their thinking, in their culture, in other societal issues, and therefore they can do at their own. instead of doing this, this counter tradition tries to question the very notion of progress and the very notion of history. And therefore, one example one can give is of Gandhi's Hind Swaraj again. In Gandhi's Hind Swaraj, what Gandhi does, that he sidesteps this issue of history altogether. Whereas Nehru's discovery, you find that there is a running thread of history. I mean, there is a parallel discourse of history trying to demonstrate that how Indian history has been rich from the very beginning, from the time immemorial. India has had all those features which can make India a nation. On the other hand, in Gandhi, we find that this is totally sidestepped, and instead of history, another category is pushed into discussion, and that is the category of civilization. Because perhaps Gandhi understood that in spite of such attempts being made by many nationalist political thinkers like Nehru and many others before him and after him, I think Gandhi realized that this exercise was full of dangers, because one can also come out with some counter arguments. Because if one tries to prove this point that India always had a very secular ethos, and one can refer to Ashoka and Akbar, then there can be another set of instances and facts from history which can be highly disturbing. Therefore, Gandhi sidesteps this issue and brings in the question of civilization and the entire question of ethics and morality. So history is replaced with ethics. History is replaced with issues of morality, and then the West is interrogated on the scale of civilization, that what is civil and what is not civil, and then entire colonial invasion is judged on this scale of civility, that how one can justify this invasion if one discusses this within the framework of civilization. And therefore, the way he defines civilization as good conduct and the way he poses this question to the Western civilization, then in fact it turns the entire table in this discourse, and therefore it makes a very important entry point into this issue of progress. Therefore, what I am trying to suggest, that all these issues, modernity, science and progress, have been important or dominant themes in Indian political thinking in modern times. And you can take any number of thinkers from Indian tradition in modern times. You can refer to any individual thinker, and you can find that these themes are running like a running commentary in their ideas. And not only their attempts to interpret or engage with these issues in their own way, but in both in terms of this derivative and imitative discourse which I just referred, but also in terms of the counter tradition, or in terms of a kind of interrogation and rejection, and trying to pose another set of questions before the entire Western political tradition. Therefore, I think that these themes are very important, and related to these themes, in fact, one can also add the entire question of self and the other, this non-dualist underpinning within this tradition, which basically goes beyond this freedom, goes beyond this institutional definition of freedom, and tries to take the discourse away from this modernity discourse or modernity frame, and pushes it in direction of emancipation. One can also see the entire issue being rephrased in terms of selfhood, and this non-dualist underpinning in this discourse of selfhood. One can also see that this entire process of othering, which is part of this modernist discourse in the West, is also overcome to great extent. I mean, when history is replaced with civilization, I mean, this entire process of othering is also undermined, and therefore this ethical issue of self and the selfhood and is posed before the entire entire humanity. Now, related to these issues, one can also see that Indian political thought, therefore, is methodologically much more richer than normally it is understood to be. And if there is any other perception about it, it is largely due to the inadequacy of methodological tools through which we try to understand Indian thought. Because as I mentioned, that this professionalization of thinking happened in India much later. Earlier it was intricate part of the societal practice, and therefore one has to basically establish a dialogue with those traditions. And when one establishes a dialogue, then the two possibilities can also be thought of. Number one, that this dialogue, one has to basically abandon this framework of zero sum game. I mean, one has to be prepared for a situation where one is not going to score a point, but simply trying to understand certain issues which can facilitate our own understanding in today's context. How those understanding, because that is how perhaps they approached their own traditions. That is how they approach their own contemporaries. That is how perhaps these Indian thinkers approach their own adversaries, if one is permitted to use the term, which I am not quite comfortable with. But nonetheless, this is how they approach their adversaries. They never try to score a point, but simply try to establish a dialogue with them in order to get certain ideas, certain clues through which a more effective and powerful emancipatory project could be built. So I think this was one important and significant dimension, and that we find both in Gandhi and Ambedkar. That we find not only in Gandhi and Ambedkar, but we can also see in some other thinkers who were trying to go beyond this entire question of freedom and moving in direction of emancipation. So therefore, I think that one has to simply be careful in not getting bogged down to those established methodological tools or methodological framework through which we normally try to approach political thought, both in the West as well as in India. Now, what we find that this alternative discourse, which was sought to be built in India, normally had a utopia in their framework, because no emancipatory discourse is possible without some reference of utopia, and that is there in the West also. Of course, it is very unfortunate that even in the Western political thought we find that the entire question of utopia at times is judged from the point of view of ideology and science, because there is a lot of debate on this issue, what is science and what is ideology, and those utopias which were not scientific were simply rejected. And interestingly, some of the utopias which were part of the larger project of emancipation were also not considered part of the mainstream thinking of that particular thinker, because that would have militated against the spirit of science. For example, the Marxist utopia, because within Marx there has been a lot of debates on this, that young Marx and the old Marx, mature Marx and immature Marx, the utopian Marx and the scientific Marx. So I think this entire utopia in the modern lexicon, or one can say that in this entire modernist frame, has been a pejorative term. But I beg to differ with this, because I feel that utopia is one important dimension of political thinking, particularly in those thinkings which have emancipation as their reference point, or emancipatory project as their mission. Whether we go back to the Greek period or to the modern period in the West, I think we can see them there. Coming back to India also, I think those traditions which were not derivative and imitative, we find that there is a great amount of utopian thinking, because only through the utopia that one can move from present to the future. It is only with the help of utopia that one can move from, from the immediate to the ultimate. And this ultimate, when the ultimate is the reference point, then there is no escape from the utopia. Now, what has happened that after 1947, as I started my presentation, that after 1947, when this professionalization of thinking was sought to be done, this utopia has has disappeared altogether as a reference point from the thinking. There is no utopia. I mean, if there is any reference of utopia, then as I mentioned in the case of the West, then perhaps it would not be scientific. And if something is not scientific within that objective frame, is not worth discussing or worth consideration. Therefore, I think there is no possibility of any thinking which can move from immediate to the ultimate, from the present to the future, which we found in the modern Indian political thinking when they were engaged with their challenges, but at the same time they are also thinking in terms of moving from their own challenges to the larger emancipation of humanity. They are interested in raising the discourse at universal level of validity and application. That is, after all, the meaning and the purpose of political thought. Now, what has happened, that this utopia, which has disappeared from the Indian thinking in recent times, one can see some amount of cravings, a quest, not within the state institutional settings, in which this political thinking was sought to be done after 1947, but in other realm, that is the realm of the society. If we take into account the social movements which are going on or going all around us, but those references of utopia or moving from the from immediate to the ultimate, I think is very incoherent, is very haphazard, at times also not well articulated. But at times we also find that this quest is there. When we talk of the new social movements, we basically refer to this environmental movement, the feminist movement, the Dalit movement. At times, we find many movements which are going on number of issues in the society. Sometimes there are certain movements which have a religious this thing, what is called new religious movements. But this is a matter of further exploration, that in what way they have been trying to build their utopia, the vision for emancipation. Because ultimately the political thought has to be judged not in terms of its methodological sophistication, not in terms of its professionalization, not in terms of its uses of the jargons which are normally acknowledged by the peer group. It is not to be judged by the quantity, but by the quality of the work, quality of the thinking, quality of the reflection, and most importantly by the fact that how much it transcends the barriers of the present or immediate and moves, or at least tries to go to the ultimate, that is perhaps the emancipation and the emancipatory project for which the entire political thought should be committed to. I will stop.
Okay, so this is the paradigm perspective in which contemporary philosophy or political science theory be interpreted what you suggest.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so well friends,
because I will just also add one thing, that this post-independent exercise which we have been discussing here for last 1 hour, there was one important moment, in fact, and that was the JP movement. It not only questioned when JP gave the call of total revolution, it was basically a call for such thinking. The limitations of the discourse which we saw after 1947, when the Indian nation and the Indian state tried to realize the vision of our freedom movement.
Correct.
But this JP movement itself became aborted exercise. Nothing tangible could emerge. Now, post JP movement, I must add that the social movements which are going on are basically trying to raise some of these issues which we have discussed, that which have been abandoned in post 47 period, particularly within the institutional framework of political thinking which has been going on within the university system,
Right.
right? Which the most modern political thinking in India before 1947 had overcome and had tried to transcend it.
So, well, friends, I hope you have understood the concept explained by Dr. Satish Jha. He gave us framework in which we need to analyze the current political practices, and we try to understand with the help of theories given by the various political science thinkers. So I hope this lecture have benefited all of you. So with this hope we conclude this lecture, and I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Dr. Satish Jha for giving such a wonderful lecture on this very topic. Thank you very much.